This video is sponsored by Squarespace, the all-in-one website building platform that anyone can use to build a stunning website with no coding knowledge. Stick around until the end of the video to learn more. Hey there guys, so I'm off to Cornwall this week, so I needed to make a quick video. Unfortunately, as ever, the script for this one ballooned out of all proportion, which makes sense considering that high-rep bodyweight training is such an important topic and something that I think really deserved an in-depth examination. With that being said, in order to get the video out to you guys in time, I did have to simplify the video editing style a little bit. I went for something more of a vibe, a mood. I've seen other YouTubers do it, people seem to like it. So let me know what you think of this style in the comments. Because although there's not as much flashy imagery, I do think this is one of the more important topics that I've been meaning to discuss on this channel. Anyways, either way, thanks so much for watching. I'm off on my journey now, so bon voyage to me. On with the show. I've spoken a fair bit about high repetition bodyweight training on this channel, especially lately. I discussed it in relation to high rep dips, in relation to working out from home, and when talking about prisoner workouts. Now I feel like it's time to look at this subject in detail, because high repetition bodyweight training might just be the most slept on technique for building a fantastic looking and highly athletic body. It's the technique I've relied on the most throughout the years, and it's the one I see get the least love and attention. I'm not exaggerating when I say that doing this correctly might just be the most efficient way to build an incredibly athletic physique. It builds shocking strength, amazing resilience and movement, endurance and aesthetics, all in one package. It's how Mike Tyson built powerful tree trunk legs, and the legendary Great Gamma. It's why we hear stories of prisoners emerging from jail with superhuman physiques. But how is this training different from other forms of calisthenics? Well, when many people discuss bodyweight training or calisthenics, they are talking about something akin to gymnastic strength training. They start out with the basics, sure, that means things like push-ups, pull-ups, sit-ups, etc. But ultimately, the goal is usually to progress to more complex movements, things like planche variations, muscle-ups, ring dips, handstands, you name it. This is brilliant stuff. It improves your body awareness or proprioception. It develops an incredible core and forces you to work on things like mobility and better movement patterns. It can also make you immensely strong. But it's very slow going. Learning to planche or handstand can take years if you ever get there, and it often leads to injuries along the way as you place unusual strain on your tendons. It also doesn't guarantee an amazing physique. Because these movements are highly compound, meaning you're using multiple muscle groups at once and not necessarily taking any one area to failure, and because the movements rely a lot on skill, tendon strength, and strength in smaller muscle groups, like those scapular retractors. It's also fairly complicated. Progressing between variations requires that you have a relatively pain-free body and an understanding of biomechanics. For those reasons, it's remained pretty niche. High-rep bodyweight training conversely means sticking with those basics, like push-ups, dips, bodyweight rows, pull-ups, tricep dips, bodyweight squats, Hindu squats, lunges, calf raises, but simply then maxing out on the repetitions. This can also be described as pump training because what we're really doing here is chasing the pump, and that same concept can be applied to some movements with weights or machines. Single joint or closed chain movements like leg press machine or curls, they can be used in just the same way. Go and watch my video on goblet curls for an example of this. But I'll be referring to this style of training in this video as high-rep bodyweight training, just for simplicity. But people avoid this kind of training because it can be pretty grueling and can seem quite boring and basic. And they also skip it because there's a lot of bad press surrounding this kind of training. Whenever I suggest that someone try to do 30, 50, 100 or 200 push-ups, they'll often tell me that that's building endurance rather than strength, that they can't get big that way. This is based on correct understanding of fitness, but they've come to the wrong conclusions. And if only they'd try it and perform it correctly, they might see amazing results. Here's what actually happens and why it works. So first, when you perform these kinds of movements, you should be aiming to go to near total muscle failure. That means you want to pick movements that are somewhat isolated, or at least closed chain. That means nothing that relies a lot on stability or body control. This keeps the tension on the target muscles, but it also keeps the movement safe as your form begins to break down. That in turn means you'll begin using fast twitch muscle fiber towards the end of the set. A lot of people disagree with this because they misunderstand Henneman's size principle. Now, Henneman's size principle, we don't need to go into it in detail, but it tells us that the body only recruits the necessary motor units and muscle fibers for any given movement, starting with the smallest motor units containing the slowest twitch muscle fibers, and then only moving to the larger and more powerful ones as the situation demands. So when you press your upper body, in a push-up for example, you likely don't need to use the big motor units, and therefore you aren't actually training them, and there's no way to make your body recruit those instead. Except maybe with plyometrics, but then you're doing so in such a rapid, burst-like manner that it's not stimulating hypertrophy. So you aren't going to get stronger if you just do a few push-ups without reaching failure. But when you go long enough, your slow twitch fibers start to fail. As the smaller motor units become fatigued, the only options available are those bigger ones. And if you tell the body to keep going now, it has to use the less efficient method to complete that task. And that way, you're able to stimulate fast twitch fiber, even with very light weight, even with partial body weight. And that way, you're able to build muscle still. You can see this happening because your movements become more jerky and you start to tremble. That's your body tapping into the inappropriately powerful motor units to complete the job, gaining power but losing finesse. And in fact, because you've stimulated the slower twitch muscle fibers first, you've actually trained an even bigger portion of the entire muscle to failure. If you use heavy weights, you'll be forced to stop once the larger motor units fatigue, but the smaller motor units haven't been taken all the way to failure in that scenario. And if you're using a more rapid tempo during the movements, you'll likewise be engaging more fast twitch muscle fiber and improving your rate of force production and explosiveness. The way I perform my push-ups, at least at the start, is borderline plyometric. That's to say that my hands are almost leaving the ground. And that's not all. You see, when you train with high rep ranges like this, maintaining pressure on a single area, that causes blood to pool up in that muscle. Blood rushes there as you contract, but it can't get back out. That in turn creates a hypoxic environment, where there's not as much oxygen as usual. Once this starts happening, more faster twitch fibers need to get involved because they are anaerobic, meaning they don't require oxygen. The slow twitch fibers can't operate in this environment. This works very similarly to tourniquet or blood flow restriction training. You're restricting the blood flow just through contraction rather than using a piece of cloth. We know that this can lead to increased muscle growth even with lighter weights. And this process has a ton of other amazing benefits too. You see, as that blood builds up in the muscle, it also nourishes the tendons. This is extremely important as tendons require a greater blood supply than muscle in order to strengthen and grow. In fact, the ATG system, known for building strong and powerful tendons, relies partly on high repetitions of short-range movements. So this is essentially what Ben Patrick, that's knees over toes guy to you, is doing when he walks backwards long distances. Yes, it's strengthening the reverse movement, but it's also just sending blood to the knees, strengthening and nourishing the tendons, ready for those long-range movements like the split squat that follows. Tendon strength training is generally slept on for athletic performance. As JC Santana discusses, if you want to run faster, it's more about the ability of your ankle tendons to rebound energy to the ground than it is about your maximum squat. That goes for all forms of connective tissue, by the way, such as the fascia. And did you know that the fascia not only surrounds the muscle, but also protrudes into it and divides it into segments called fascicles, surrounded by the epimysium? We ignore this when talking about hypertrophy, but that's madness, considering that your muscle mass is comprised of roughly 20% connective tissue. You want to grow and strengthen that connective tissue? High rep ranges will help you to do that. But that build-up also has other side effects that lead to growth. For one, it leads to metabolic stress, one of the big three factors contributing to hypertrophy. Continuous time under tension causes metabolites such as lactate and growth factors to build up there, resulting in a more anabolic environment that signals the body to upregulate protein synthesis. In other words, as the blood pools and can't escape, so too do the chemicals that tell the muscle to grow. The body releases them and they travel via the blood to that area where they get trapped, essentially. So when I described movements like dips as miracle grow, it's because they kind of are. You can actually see the pooling of blood and water in the muscle after this kind of training in the form of the pump. And while many forms of training will bring on a pump, few methods are as effective and efficient at doing so as high repetition bodyweight training. And this is where we can visually see the difference. Advanced calisthenics doesn't bring about as much of a pump for all the reasons I described, and the same is true for powerlifting. There you will have systemic fatigue and soreness, but no one muscle group is flooded with blood in quite the same way right away, because lots of muscles are working together and because you'll be forced to put the weight down before you get to that point. You can absolutely get a massive pump in the chest from bench press and then the legs from squatting, but not compared to a bodybuilder who's using isolation and intensity techniques to absolutely hammer their pecs or quads. High rep training does something similar, but it does so without causing the huge amounts of muscle damage that, while useful for further enhancing growth, yes it is and we'll talk about that later, isn't super efficient and can make recovery and frequent training difficult. High rep bodyweight training is simply the most efficient way to get this response. So the bros were right, chasing pump is smart, and we knew this all along really. It's intuitive, but it also means that when you're training this way, you need to make sure you're feeling the pump for it to work. And once you have, you're pretty much good to move on to the next area. And we're just scratching the surface, there are more reasons this works too. For example, that metabolic buildup can also come with cell swelling. In other words, the muscle cell actually swells due to the influx of water, which places a form of mechanical stress on the cell membrane. This actually causes more chemicals to be released, which further stimulates protein synthesis. I'd like to point out at this juncture that the precise science here can get a little muddy. That's to say, not only is it complicated, but there is some debate as to precisely which mechanisms play the biggest role and to what extent, and what's simply a correlating byproduct. But the point is, there is ample evidence to suggest that somehow creating tension in the cells this way does trigger growth. And this is why it's kind of nuts when people argue that you only need mechanical tension like it's their football team, because high rep training causes growth partially through another form of mechanical tension. They're not all that different. And because it still includes the kind of mechanical tension we typically associate with higher loads, just to a lesser degree. You're still getting some of the same signals, and whilst the amount of tension is lower, it's also more continuous, causing all of that aforementioned buildup. It's like the energy systems or muscle fibers in this way. People like to describe things and then put them into boxes, talk about training the aerobic system or the anaerobic system, just like we talk about training muscle damage or metabolic stress or mechanical tension, when in reality, we're always doing all of those things, even when walking. And there are countless other factors too, like blood supply, connective tissue hypertrophy, muscle fiber type conversion, intramuscular coordination. Oh, and speaking of blood supply again, there's another way that gets improved too, through angiogenesis, and this one's massive. I talk about this all the time, but it's basically the formation of new blood vessels to supply the muscle with more blood. High rep training is particularly good for this because of that whole blood restriction thing. You're telling the body it needs more blood supply. And this is huge because it not only means you get more blood during your workouts, allowing for more energy and bigger sets, it also means you get more blood during recovery. And that means you can train with greater frequency and even greater recovery from injury. And one more thing, studies show a correlation between increased angiogenesis and a higher myonuclei and satellite cell count. Myonuclei are responsible for protein synthesis, and so this then leads to even greater muscle growth. In case you were starting to think that high rep calisthenics is a cheat code, well yeah. So why don't more people talk about this? Well, it's for the reasons I described before, but there's also more. One of the big complaints is that you still can't get as strong as you could with very heavy weights. When I first went to the gym, having only performed hundreds of push-ups, I was already able to bench over 100 kilograms. Like I said, high rep calisthenics does build strength, but not as much as powerlifting or bodybuilding. You likely won't ever bench press 200 kilograms without actually lifting weights. But my question is, do you need to? When you consider that this form of training alone is not only giving you ample strength, but also explosiveness, resilient tendons, and a great physique, without having to commit so much effort to an achievement that is largely just for bragging rights. And here's the other big thing. This kind of training also builds endurance, both local endurance due to that increased blood supply, but also global endurance. Those higher rep ranges do mean your heart is working harder for an extended period of time. And this is brilliant because it means you're going to build strength endurance, the ability to exert strength for an extended period of time, rather than just in one burst, which is what most training focuses on. This means you'll be able to perform better in sports, doing physically demanding work, playing with your kids, wrestling or sparring, carrying heavy loads, basically doing anything that requires strength outside the gym. Training for higher rep ranges is more functional because almost everything we do involves higher rep ranges. We don't use our abilities in discrete packages. We don't just use strength or endurance. We always use strength in conjunction with balance, endurance, explosiveness, and mobility in a concert. Again, bodyweight training is just so efficient for this. But won't you cause repetitive strain injuries, you ask, when you're performing such high rep ranges? Well, do you get repetitive strain injury from walking or driving? That's just my sassy way of saying, no, you won't. The body doesn't break down from repeated use. We don't have a set number of reps before we go kaput. What's more likely is that you develop an imbalance, which is what many people are actually experiencing when they talk about repetitive strain injuries. If you're doing hundreds of push-ups and no horizontal pulling movement, for example, you're going to cause an imbalance, and this can lead to pain and discomfort. And this means you need a well-rounded program. And I personally recommend not overlooking things like movement in the rotational plane or frontal plane either. That's one mistake that a lot of people who use this kind of training will still make. Of course, if you like the idea of training this way, you can check out my ebook and training program, Super Functional Training 2.0. That book applies many of these ideas, but combines this high-rep training with more complex and strength and skill-oriented movements at the start of each set as a form of mechanical drop set. That builds size and strength and mobility and endurance, and you can check that out in the description below. Of course, you can get tendinitis, for example, if you go too hard too soon, if you train for super high reps when you're not ready. Like anything then, you need to build up to this, but once you do, you'll actually be extremely resilient against that kind of injury. The other issue many people have is with the sheer amount of time they think they're going to need to dedicate to this kind of training. Hundreds of push-ups sounds grueling, sounds boring, and it is. And honestly, that's why I fell off the high-rep bodyweight training train a while back. At one point, I built up to doing sets of 250 push-ups, and I just started to dread doing my workouts. I can't do that now, by the way, but I'm building back up there. Then I realized I didn't need to be such a purist. You can still, of course, progress in other ways. Switching from push-ups to dips as my main pushing movement, for example, brought my workout time down significantly. Likewise, I started incorporating drop sets, again, which can significantly shorten your workout times, going from dips straight into push-ups, for example. And I realized that 2 sets was usually plenty for the majority of these exercises, because that's still far more total volume than the usual 3x8 that you're probably doing before. I also focus more on the concentric portion of the movement in many cases. Though I often will create a slight bounce and muscle stretch at the bottom of each rep, I don't recommend doing that until you're more experienced though. By focusing more on the concentric and training with more explosiveness, I actually reduce muscle damage. This lets me train with more frequency, which massively increases the spikes in protein synthesis that I experience. Imagine just stopping and doing 2 sets of 30 dips in the kitchen in the middle of the day. It's good stuff. But it also means that I don't feel fatigued anymore. Perfect for training as a parent, which, let's face it, does have a lot in common with training from jail actually. But also perfect for letting me practice hand balancing, martial arts, sprinting, kettlebell training, and other skills in my spare time. And as I repeatedly say, if you want your physique and strength and explosiveness to translate to better performance, you need to practice that performance. Want to run faster? You need to actually run. If you spend every last minute lifting insanely heavy weights, you can't do that. Resistance training should always be in service of something. We train for something. When resistance training is the end in itself, it becomes far less useful and applicable. Training this way hopefully remembers that. Okay, you made it this far, so now I'm going to share with you one more big secret to building a massive physique. And it's one of the reasons that my body has blown up in recent months after switching back to this kind of training. It's creatine. But more specifically, it's combining creatine with this kind of high-rep training. It's game-changing and leads to further increased muscle growth and performance. Why? Because creatine allows for longer sustained contractions via the recycling of ATP, meaning you get better at doing longer sets, so you get better at this style of training. But it also works both ways because it also draws more water into the muscle cells, compounding all of that increased cell volumization, and meaning you get all those effects to a greater degree. It's just something I've noticed when training myself and others, but for me the results have been pretty massive anecdotally, and there's ample theoretical explanation for how and why this should work. I'm sorry if it seems like I've gone on a bit on this one. I just really wanted to explain why and how this type of training is so profoundly effective, because it's something I really believe in. With heavyweight training dominating the conversation in terms of fitness, I feel that I'm automatically fighting an uphill battle when advocating for this kind of strategy. But please try it, I think you'll be pleasantly surprised. Then come back here and share your results with everyone else. Either way, thank you so much for watching this one, guys, and bye for now. By the way, guys, this video was sponsored by Squarespace. Squarespace is a website building platform that makes it extremely simple for anyone to get started with their own website. It does this by providing all the tools you could possibly need in an extremely accessible and intuitive package. And you can have a website up and running in literal minutes. To get started, you can either choose from a wide selection of ready-made and beautiful templates, or use their Blueprint AI feature to create something wholly bespoke with no coding required. From there, it's very simple to modify and customize everything to your precise requirements. There's even coding tools for those who do feel a bit more confident. Adding features is also extremely simple, with a huge range of plugins to choose from. Whether you want search engine optimization to ensure maximum visibility for your website on Google, or invoicing features for billing clients and getting paid. Literally anything you might need as a small entrepreneur, a creative, or a massive business, which is why Squarespace is used by some of the biggest brands on the web. So head to squarespace.com to learn more, or go to squarespace.com/pioneer when you're ready to launch, and you'll gain 10% off your first domain or website. Thanks again to Squarespace for sponsoring this video. Thanks to you guys, and once again, bye for now.